Okay, guys, so we are starting a new unit. This particular unit is going to be focusing on health behaviors. So we're going to be talking eventually about things like exercise, sleep, diet, nutrition, and substance use. But before we get to those behaviors, we're going to talk about health behaviors in general. Why do people do what they do? And messaging. So how can we edit and attend to not just what we say, but how we say it in order to help kind of steer people towards the health behaviors that we know are good for them. Okay. So to start things off, let's kind of first define what a health behavior is. So health behaviors are any type of action that are aimed at improving or maintaining a person's health. So this includes the more common things, the things I just talked about, exercise, diet, and sleep are the ones I always harp on. Substance is one that I work on a lot in my practice, but other things include things like wearing sunscreen, safe sex, wearing seatbelts, anything that is preventing death, promoting longevity, promoting health. It's worth noting that pretty much all behaviors exist on a continuum in which we can see more or less use of that behavior. And we can also see a positive and a negative impact depending on where on that continuum a person is. So, exercise and healthy diets are good examples. Obviously, the lack of exercise or healthy diet is not going to be great for a person's health. But on the flip side, taking those things to an extreme can come with a negative health impact. So we can deal with, injury or dangerously low weight or malnutrition from taking those things to an extreme. Similarly, other substances, things that you might normally think of as being not great for you, like alcohol and caffeine, also tend to exist on more of like this positive negative kind of continuum where too much alcohol for males and females is associated with health complications. But with alcohol, depending on what health condition it is we're concerned about, there does seem to be a sweet spot for both males and females in terms of a safe amount to consume regularly with minimal likelihood of a health complication at the end of the day. Caffeine is another good example. It's one that is relatively benign, doesn't really get talked about a whole lot within the substance community, but it's definitely something that can cause problems. It can cause addiction, even though it's one of the more benign ones. And it's something that, depending on the condition we're talking about, should be potentially avoided. So if we're talking about like a pregnant woman, for instance, or someone with a heart complication, then decreasing caffeine might be a good idea. It's also worth pointing out that when we talk about health behaviors, improving or maintaining health, or avoiding some negative health outcome, it's important to focus on whether that outcome is in the immediate future or it is more kind of far off in the future. So, like not wearing a seatbelt can have a very immediate consequence if a person were to get into a car accident, but there's not really going to be an immediate consequence to eating a cheeseburger. Rather, a more long term chronic unhealthy diet is the type of problem that is going to be problematic and contribute to poor health outcomes in the long run. A final piece that I'll kind of point out about health behaviors is that they are additive, meaning that abiding by more than one health behavior is going to be better for your health than just one. So, exercising regularly and eating healthy diet is going to be better for you than just one of those. So, there are combined effects, but there are also offsetting effects, meaning that if you smoke, for instance, or engage in a health risk behavior, you're not going to magically undo that behavior by engaging in a health behavior, but it certainly is going to be better to exercise regularly and eat a healthy diet while also smoking than to just kind of smoke without any type of health behavior. So there are combined and offsetting effects here. So the bulk really of what we're going to talk about today are these various theories and concepts that explain why people engage or do not engage in healthful or unhealthful behaviors. So the main aim of this lecture is to explore basically why people do what they do and how do we get people engaged in healthier behaviors. So we're going to talk about a couple of theories first. We're going to talk about the health belief model, the theory of planned behavior, and the trans theoretical model. We're going to talk about some other kind of pieces to consider in terms of understanding behavior. We're going to talk a little bit more about how the benefits of high risk behaviors can help explain why people engage in those behaviors. We're also going to talk more about help seeking tendencies, so why some people seek out help and go to the doctor, whereas others don't. And then we're going to talk more about some community level health psychology approaches, meaning we're not focused as much on an individual patient and how to get them healthier, but we're focused on billboards and campaigns and ads and how do we get larger groups of people healthier collectively. So within that vein, we'll talk a little bit about the precede proceed model, effective programming, and then effective language and messaging. So up first, we have the health belief model. The health belief model basically says that health behavior decisions are based on 4 interacting factors: perceived susceptibility, perceived severity, perceived benefits and barriers, and cues to action. So, perceived susceptibility is how susceptible a person believes they are to a particular outcome as a consequence of their behavior. So, note that perceived is in here, meaning that's a person's belief versus how objectively susceptible they believe they are. Perceived severity is similar. So, how severe does the person believe an outcome is based on their behavior? Again, perceived versus objective severity. Perceived benefits and barriers. So, what does the person believe the benefits are to adjusting their behavior versus what does the person believe are the barriers to adjusting behavior? And again, these are perceptions, so these aren't the actual benefits or the actual barriers. And then finally, we can predict behavior change with cues to action, which would be triggers or cues within a person's environment that might kind of nudge them towards changing a behavior right now. So, the example that I always give with the health belief model is that of my very best friend, who is also a therapist, which makes this story particularly funny. So we were in graduate school together, and she and I are very similar. But she's definitely more anxious than I am. In particular, she has very health specific anxiety. And it's not just general health anxiety in that she's worried about getting sick, but in particular, she has a very specific fear that she will get HIV, which is particularly funny given that she's been with her now husband since high school, and they've been in a monogamous relationship for at least a decade at this point and had been together for like 7 years or something when I met her. So if we think about the risks of getting HIV, she was very low risk. But in her mind, she was extremely likely to get HIV. She believed that getting HIV was the end of the world. And I'm not trying to like downgrade the severity of HIV and AIDS. We'll talk more about that diagnosis later in the semester. But in a nutshell, the treatments that we have for those diagnoses now make them a much more livable set of diagnoses with a higher quality of life than like the 80s perception of AIDS. And my friend has very much an 80s perception of HIV and AIDS. So the severity level is very, very high. And so for her, if she thinks she might have HIV as a consequence of something she's done recently, she thinks there are tremendous benefits to going and getting tested right now. She will have peace of mind, and that is worth taking the time off of work or from school to go and sit and get that test. So, whereas for some people, the idea of getting tested for an STI is a huge pain in the butt and a huge barrier, and you've got to go do this thing, and like, I've really got to be worried or think that I might have an STI in order to go do that. For her, it's a very small barrier for a very big benefit. And so that helps to explain why, in situations like she's walking around outside barefoot and feels sketchy about something she thinks she sees on the sidewalk, she thinks, oh, I've got HIV, and is really freaked out. And so for her, small barrier to going to getting tested, huge benefit to having that kind of relief and peace of mind. So using this model is a really nice, clean, easy way to explain why she does what she does around getting tested for HIV. The next theory is the theory of planned behavior. In many ways, this is the simplest one because it basically says that, hey, you want to be able to predict and understand what a person is going to do. Simply ask them what it is they intend to do, and that will lead you to their future behavior. So behavioral intention predicts behavior. Basically, if I were to ask a person, hey, are you planning on binge drinking tonight? And they said yes, then they're likely to binge drink. So very very simple theory. Where it becomes a little bit more complicated is in terms of the three factors that inform what a person's behavioral intention is, which broadly speaking are their attitude, their subjective norm, and their perceived behavioral control. So let's break down which each of those things is. An attitude is how a person feels about a particular behavior. So again, using binge drinking as an example, a person's attitude may be that binge drinking is dangerous. A subjective norm is what they think other people think of the behavior. So the person may believe that everybody else is binge drinking. And perceived behavioral control is to what degree does this person believe they have control over the situation and their own ability to make a decision in this situation. So if the same person believes, let's say they're, new to a new college and they believe that if they want to be liked and make friends that they have to go along with drinking, otherwise nobody will like them. So they truly believe this decision is out of their control and that, like, sure, they can not binge drink, but then they won't make any friends, and so if they want to make friends they must binge drink. Then at the end of the day, their intention based on this attitude, this subjective norm, and their behavioral perceived behavioral control may be that, okay, I'm going to binge drink and I'm going to party as a way to make friends, but then once I'm accepted into a group, I'll back off. And so if that's their intention, to binge drink temporarily and then stop once they're kind of socially settled, then that's likely what they're going to do. So intention predicts behavior, and attitude, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control predict intention. The third model of behavior change is the trans-theoretical model, or the stages of change model. This is a really handy model to use to predict what a person will do based on where they're at in terms of contemplating behavior change. So there are 5 stages. Pre-contemplation is when a person has not yet even thought about changing their behavior. And so at this point, are they going to change their behavior? No, they hadn't even thought about it yet. Contemplation is they're thinking about changing their behavior, but they haven't yet made up their mind. So are they going to change their behavior? Maybe. Depends on the decision they arrive at. Preparation is when they've decided to change their behavior. So let's say we're talking about like quitting smoking. So this person has decided they're going to quit. They haven't quit yet, but they're prepping. So are they changing their behavior? Not yet, but we can assume that they will and that they're currently preparing. Action stage is quit day, when the person is quitting. So what's their behavior at this point? They are quitting, they're doing. And then maintenance is the often forgotten stage at the end here, where a person continues to keep going. So nothing new is really happening per se, but this is very much an active stage, and that takes a lot of effort to maintain progress and to keep going. And this is where a lot of people get stuck with behavior change. So we've got someone who's trying to quit smoking or quit drinking, or who's trying to exercise differently, or adopt a healthier diet, or whatever. Is they just think about quit day, or the day that we're going to start running, or the day that we are going to um, cut out sodas or something like that. But they don't think about waking up and making that choice again and again every single day. And so that's where we really, my opinion, as far as this model goes, is that the maintenance stage is where all healthcare providers, mental health and physical healthcare providers, can really do the most good, is by talking to our patients about the fact that we should not neglect this phase. We should not just assume that quitting or making that behavior change is the most important part, because that's just one day. Really, the hard part is continuing to do better conceivably for the rest of your life. And so I find with patients, it's just helpful to talk about that up front, that that is really a hard part. And that in some ways, humans are imperfect creatures. In many ways, humans are imperfect creatures. And if we're really talking about like working out 3 days a week for the rest of your life, like realistically, that's not going to happen. Stuff's going to come up and you're not going to work out 3 days a week for the rest of your life. And so it's talking about, what are you going to do on that week when you're sick and you should realistically rest versus exercising? How do we take a break that week and then kind of get back on the horse and get back into the routine? So it's making plans really for the likelihood that a person's not going to be perfect, so that they can just not be perfect, but also not completely fall back to where they were. Another perspective that I find helpful in explaining why people do what they do, particularly around health risk or high risk behaviors, is to address why people do that. And why people do pretty much any behavior is because there's some benefit to that behavior. There's some positive outcome that this person is seeking. And many models, I find the biggest detriment of many models is that they focus too much on the risks of unhealthy behaviors. So the classic would be, the picture of the nasty lung on the stop smoking ads. Like everybody knows about that at this point. We are aware that health risk behaviors obviously come with risks and poor health outcomes. But people continue to engage in those behaviors for a reason. What is that reason? That reason is because there's some benefit. There's something that is fun or enticing about this risk behavior. There's something fun about drinking or using substances. There's something fun about just being able to have sex impulsively without pausing to think about protection. And so studies show that if we can attend to these benefits, that we can basically potentially have a greater likelihood of success in terms of changing a person's behavior. And these same studies show that people who continue to engage in high risk behaviors are again fully aware of the consequences of the behaviors they're engaged in. So teenagers, for instance, actually like really weigh the pros and cons of behaviors like underage drinking. They often conclude that there are benefits, things like getting a buzz, feeling good, having a good time. If we've got a teenager who's a little bit more socially awkward, alcohol can be that social lubricant that makes it easier to socialize and talk with people. And teenagers are aware that there are consequences, things like getting sick, regretting one's actions, embarrassing themselves, even more significant consequences like maybe getting into an accident. But at the end of the day, the reason that teenagers choose to drink in these situations is because they oftentimes conclude that the benefits are more likely than the risks. So it's not that they're unaware of the risks and that showing them, the classic dare mashed up car on the front lawn of the highway to show you what happens when you get behind the wheel when you're drunk. That, like, that's not the solution. They're aware of the risks, but at the end of the day they basically believe there's like a 1% chance of them ending up in a car like that, and there's like a 99% chance of them getting a buzz and having a good time, and so they're going to drink because they think there's a higher likelihood of the good thing coming through. Therefore, if we are trying to focus on either individual behavior change or like grander or kind of community campaign level change, it can be helpful to analyze the benefits of risk behaviors and try to find ways to help people access those benefits without the health behavior or the health risk behavior. So, for instance, if teenagers are drinking, or young people in general are drinking a lot because they want to feel good, they want to have a good time, they want to socialize more easily, then maybe more of like an interpersonal approach that's kind of focused more on boosting kids' self confidence, self esteem, self efficacy, and confidence in their social skills would make more sense. Or finding ways to maybe encourage other types of behaviors that could facilitate dopamine, like exercise, would maybe be a way to approach the situation versus the classic kind of dare, scare tactic. So one thing that I'm going to ask you guys to share a little bit about on Monday is to think about what is the benefit, what's the pro, I guess, that you take away from a risk behavior, and then how would you creatively apply that benefit to the health behavior. So what are the benefits of a sedentary lifestyle, a poor diet, of smoking, of heavy drinking, of deficient sleep? And how could I give that benefit to a patient by helping them to shift over to a health behavior instead? So get creative with this. Just pick one, or you can pick a couple if you want, and just kind of brainstorm it a little bit and be prepared to discuss on Monday. Um, Our next topic is going to be help seeking tendencies and behaviors. So, in a nutshell, we're going to be talking about why some people seek help. So, on the left side of the screen are various factors that contribute to a person's tendency to go to the doctor, basically when they're sick. And then the other side of the screen, we've got a series of traits and tendencies that contribute to the opposite, contribute to people delaying seeking help when they're sick, or traits that contribute to a person not following through with a physician's recommendations, which or any healthcare provider's recommendations, which is sometimes referred to as non-adherence. So on the help seeking side of things, why do people seek out help? A couple different things. Age actually plays a role. Kids and older adults are the age groups that are most likely to go to the doctor. This isn't always necessarily because the child or the older adult wants to go to the doctor per se. You could kind of conceive of both of these age groups as being the more dependent age groups, and being dependent on adults for help in some cases. And so much of this has to do with the fact that, like, parents are taking their children to the doctors, or adult children are taking their parents to the doctors. But also these can be some times where there's just a greater need for more regular doctor's appointments. So because kids are growing and changing so much, the idea of going to an annual checkup at minimum is something that happens more for this age group, versus with older adults, we've got a greater likelihood of health conditions and reasons to just be in a doctor's office at a regular interval. Psychologically, personality could contribute to help seeking behaviors. In particular, sensitizers, neurotics, and optimists are some of the types of people that are most likely to seek out help. A sensitizer is someone who is very kind of in tune with their body. So someone who has a tendency to focus on their body, to really notice if something is off, to really notice, like, if a mole has changed size, or if the maybe a stomach pain is a little off, or their stool looks a little off. Those are people that are more likely to go to the doctor. Neurotic folks, so folks that have a greater tendency to be angry, anxious, depressed, these are people that are more likely to seek help. Um, or go to the doctor, I should say. And optimists are some that are also more likely to go to the doctor if they're sick. Another piece psychologically that contributes to help seeking behaviors is perceived control. So, if a person believes there's something that can be done about the symptom that they're picking up on, they're more likely to go to the doctor. So, like, if I'm sitting at home and I broke my leg, there's obviously something I can do about that. I need to go to the doctor to get a cast. But if I break my tailbone or some other type of injury where there's not really a whole lot you can do about it, you're going to be less likely to go to the doctor in that situation. Some social factors also drive help seeking behaviors. Women are more likely to seek help than men. Those of a higher SES, higher income level, are also more likely to seek help. A lot of that has to do with resources. Also, those with more of a Western medicine orientation, that is, people with a stronger belief in Western medicine, are more likely to go to the doctor. People with less of a reliance on Western medicine are more likely to rely on a cultural lay referral system, meaning that rather than go to the doctor if you have a sleep problem, you're more likely to kind of talk to your neighbor or an aunt or an uncle or someone within your religious or spiritual group and kind of ask for advice or a referral within that particular group versus kind of reaching outwards into the Western medicine system. Some other things that facilitate help seeking behaviors are have to do with illness representations. Illness representations, it's kind of a jargony word. It basically means how a person is kind of conceptualizing their illness or their symptoms. So people are more likely to go to the doctor with severe symptoms, specifically pain and bleeding are two of the most common reasons that people go to the doctor. People are also more likely to go to the doctor for chronic symptoms, which makes sense. A lot of people will kind of like wait and see if it goes away, and if it doesn't, they'll go to the doctor. So if you're trying to predict whether a person will go to the doctor or not, it's important to basically attend to the age of the person, their personality, how controllable is the symptom, like are there treatments or not, social factors, and then also the severity and the chronicity of the symptom. In terms of delay behavior, some things to kind of focus on in terms of predicting who's more likely to delay going to the doctor are going to be people with poor attentional focus. So this is basically the opposite of a sensitizer. This is the type of person who, is like walking around and has like a massive bruise on their leg, and you're like, oh, like how'd you get that? And they're like, oh, like I don't know, I didn't even notice that was there. That's someone with poor attentional focus. Someone who has more familiar, less severe symptoms. So if a person regularly has headaches, they're less likely to go to the doctor than someone who's like had their first really intense headache or migraine. Less severe symptoms, so things that aren't really impairing, less likely to go to the doctor, or at least more likely to delay going. And then financial concerns about treatment costs can also delay behavior. So those are three things that predict delays. Non-adherence, which is this is a person who's gone, they've gotten advice from someone, but now they're not following through on that advice. People with substance use, anxiety, and depressive disorders are less likely to follow through with professional advice, and sometimes provider variables. That is, how the provider interacts with the patient can also do a lot in terms of whether or not the patient will adhere or not. So it's important to talk about what we do as professionals that can help predict whether our patients will do what it is we want them to do or not. So if you want to promote adherence and future help seeking behaviors, what can you do? One is to provide simple instructions. Most adults read at an 8th grade level, and about 20% actually read at less than a 5th grade level, or 5th grade or less. But most health related pamphlets are written at a 10th grade reading level. So provide simple layperson instructions aiming for fifth grade reading level. Also consider the patient's lifestyle and the involvement of family members. If you are sending a patient home to like their spouse or their parents or their adult children or a close group of friends or neighbors, that makes your recommendations and your jobs as a provider a lot easier than if you're sending a person home who basically lives by themselves. Like right now, I'm working with a client who has an alcohol use disorder. And they live by themselves. Their family lives in another state. And so, me trying to keep them on track as a person who's living alone is during a pandemic, let alone so, the ability to socialize is impaired, is very different than if I was sending someone home with recommendations and I knew that like their parents or their partner or their roommate were there to kind of keep an eye on them and hold them accountable. So it's important to kind of keep that stuff in mind. Lifestyle has to do with more like what a person does typically in their day. So you don't want to provide a recommendation that is so far away from what this person already does. So, like, ideally, you would want your patients to maybe be consuming a balanced diet with that consists of like whole foods. That's generally considered to be one of the healthier types of diets. But if your patient is currently living in an urban food desert or on food stamps or just has like a really unhealthy diet, it might make more sense to start focusing on like, okay, let's start eliminating sugary or caloric drinks as kind of an initial step. So that's what I mean when I say consider lifestyle and involvement of family members. Provide feedback regarding progress. This is something that loses a lot of patients is they might be coming in regularly for appointments, and physicians or providers in general may just neglect to tell the person, like, hey, you're doing a really good job. Or if you're keeping track of the person's progress, whether that be their weight or their cholesterol or the number of depressive symptoms that they have, it can be helpful to even show a chart and show the person kind of where they're at. Or even if you don't have that, to verbally talk through with the person where they're at and how well they're doing. Because if in your mind you recognize they're doing better, but you're not sharing that with them, then the person's not really being reinforced for what they're doing and they don't understand the extent to which they're doing better. And that can contribute to them kind of dropping off because in their minds, they may not understand how much better they're doing. You can be more empathetic. Um, Patients appreciate nice bedside manner, understanding of their circumstances. So that kind of goes back to what we talked about with racism and understanding environmental causes of patient behaviors and the context, what's going on, right? So, like, your roommate's not an asshole for not doing the dishes. They are busy, there's stuff going on. So, empathy, understanding what a person's feeling, what they're thinking, why it is what they're doing, and just kind of, approaching them as a person versus having more uptight, formal, business-like demeanor. Listen, let the person finish what they're saying. Don't interrupt. About 2/3 of physicians interrupt patients after 18 seconds. So just listen and let people finish their thoughts. Additionally, there are possible systemic changes to consider as well. Things like the waiting room article that we read. So, utilizing waiting rooms to promote patient literacy, advocacy, preparedness for appointments, using translators if you're working with people who don't speak English, using telemedicine to increase access. You might not have people that can come in or take off work, or drive to hospitals in other cities or towns, particularly for basic things like check-ins. And so telemedicine can be really helpful for these things. Okay, so switching gears now. So now we're going to focus more on community level things. So again, to this point, we've talked more about how to predict what people are going to do, and then most recently, specifically, how to predict what people are going to do with respect to help seeking and adherence behaviors. So now we're shifting to how can we help influence behavior on a more kind of large scale. So to start off, we're going to introduce the pre-seed proceed model, which is the most widely used model in health education. It's commonly used to help influence groups, and then also just within community education at large, whether or not we're really kind of focusing on health. So the first step in the pre-seed proceed model, and in a nutshell, what pre-seed proceed means, it's kind of a stupid name, basically means you have to first identify what precedes a problematic behavior before proceeding with your solution. So step one is to identify a health problem within a target group. So a bold target group, because this is a major takeaway from community level intervention, and one of the reasons why community level campaigning often goes wrong. Like if you're trying to get everybody to stop smoking, you're barking up the wrong tree, because that same messaging is not going to universally appeal to everybody. So you've got to focus on getting boomers to stop smoking versus getting teens to stop vaping. You have to identify contributing lifestyle or environmental elements. So, what are some pieces of this group's lifestyle or their environment that contribute to the problematic behavior? So, the example that I'm going to use to kind of flesh this all out is lung cancer in adult men. So, the problem that you're focusing on is lung cancer and specifically adult men. So, we're not talking about kids, we're not talking about women, we're talking about adult men. So, lifestyle and environmental elements that may play a role, cigarette use, obviously, secondhand smoke, environmental pollutants. So, you might have um, uh, like trades people, for instance, who have a higher risk of lung cancer because of the, why am I blanking on the word, the carcinogens that they work with at work. So, you want to really flesh out all the different lifestyle and environmental elements that play a role. You also want to think about the protective lifestyle and environmental elements. So, steps 2 and 3 kind of complement each other, the pieces that make the situation worse and the pieces that make the situation better. So, strong connection to social institutions would be something that makes the situation better. Step 4 is to analyze background factors that may predispose, enable, or reinforce everything that you identified in step number 2. So, what predisposes or sets up adult men with lung cancer to smoking cigarettes, inhaling secondhand smoke, or exposing themselves to environmental pollutants? Family history could predispose cigarette use, family history in terms of like what your family does, like maybe everybody in your family is in construction or home repair, and everybody smokes because of that job or is exposed to other carcinogens because of that job. The availability of cigarettes is going to be a piece, like how available cigarettes were when this particular group of individuals was younger. There, as far as cigarettes go, they're pretty minimal sanctions. Like well, now you've got to be 21, but I mean, previously it was 18. They were, regular or not regularly, relatively easy to get, I guess, as far as substances go. There's less social pressure around cigarette use. There's media modeling, and a lot of the stuff as far as cigarettes go really happens in the teenage years, when, the emotional part of your brain's very developed, but the critical thinking part of your brain isn't quite as developed. And then step 5 is to come up with a health ed plan, kind of bringing all this information together. So the problem, who we're focusing on, the risk factors, the protective factors, and then what kind of sets up the risk factors. So maybe what we decide to do is as a consequence of all this information is to improve teen ability to resist social pressure, by providing more positive role models, stricter sanctions around a person's ability to get their hands on cigarettes, and higher sales tax. And this is our campaign to prevent current teenagers from joining this group, which is adult men with lung cancer. So that's the pre-seed proceed model. And again, if you end up working in kind of community level campaigns, this is a really popular model that is used to kind of break down problems before going forward. So it's not really a model that's used to predict what a person uses, but it's kind of a foundational model that helps to set up some of these other pieces. So when we're going ahead with designing a program, so once we've gotten to step 5 of that model, it can be helpful to acknowledge the types of programs that work and the types of programs that don't work. So the types of programs that we can use to predict behavior change and the types of programs that we can use to predict the lack of behavior change. So focusing first on programming that doesn't work. Information campaigns that are based on the hazards of risk behaviors typically facilitate poor motivation in the long run, because you're kind of capitalizing on this fear and avoidance type of mentality. And at this point, we've already talked about avoidant coping, and that it's the least healthy type of coping because you're basically trying to just kind of avoid the problem and avoid an outcome. And so you're basically showing someone something really scary, and your aim is like, hey, like, you don't want this scary thing to happen to you. You want to avoid this. But these campaigns oftentimes don't really tell you what you need to do instead, which is one of the reasons they can fail. Another reason that these more kind of scare tactic, kind of hazardy types of campaigns fail has to do with comparative optimism, which is kind of what we talked about when we talked about the teens who think there's like a 99% chance of getting buzzed and a 1% chance of getting into a car accident. Is people see the risks and the hazards, but they just basically think it's not going to happen to them. That's something that we call comparative optimism. So you acknowledge that the risk is there, but you don't really think it's going to happen to me. Like, I'm not going to get skin cancer because I don't wear sunscreen. I'm not going to get into a car accident as a consequence of drunk driving. The risks are there, but it's just not going to happen to me. And so those campaigns kind of fall short for that reason. Scare tactics aren't always helpful because they just typically make people anxious, particularly neurotic individuals, and they just prompt like denial of the problem or avoidance of the problem. Single shot campaigns aren't too helpful either. Single shot campaigns are just kind of one dimensional campaigns. So, like, if your whole campaign is like one of these posters, that would be a single shot campaign. Or similarly, a campaign that is just billboards or just pamphlets. Typically, the more successful campaigns are campaigns with kind of layers and facets to them. Campaigns that don't provide solutions or suggestions aren't helpful. So, like, this kid who is crying within a smoke bag, or this other kid who is smoking and that smoke is forming a gun. Like, those are just kind of scary images, but none of these really give us any indicator as to what we should do if we want to avoid that outcome. And you see that a lot from scare campaigns. The scare campaign is kind of it. There's really nothing else to it. Also, general untailored campaigns don't really work too well. So that's the importance of not just focusing on the behavior or the outcome, but the target audience, because, like smoking, for instance, that's just a really good example, because getting a 60 or 70-year-old to quit smoking when they've been doing that their whole life is very different than getting like a teenager or a Gen Zer to quit vaping. Just two completely different animals. So tailored campaigns are going to be more successful. So what is a type of programming that works? First of all, the most successful programming is multifaceted in nature, meaning there are layers, there are elements. So one example is the Pool Cool program. It targets sun protection habits by providing information to kids during swim lessons. So, when kids are learning to swim and they're learning about pool safety, they're also learning about the importance of always putting on sunscreen when you get to the pool. Kids are also provided with free sunscreen. There are interactive activities around the fun of using sunscreen. And then separate information is also provided to the parents about sunscreen, and then also to lifeguards. So lifeguards are not just looking for, like, no running on the pool deck, but also, kind of scanning and like making sure that when new patrons arrive, they're, putting on sunscreen, or looking out for patrons that might be looking kind of red or spending a lot of time in the sun. Other programming that works is moderately fear arousing messages. So that means you can talk about the risks and the negative outcomes of health risk behaviors, but they should be moderate in nature. Like they shouldn't be like this guy's stoma or a scary lung. They should be moderate, but only if those messages are coupled with behavioral suggestions within the target's perceived control. So we've got to include moderate information about the risk, tell the person what they should do, and make sure that what we're telling them is written with a fifth grade reading level in mind, and that it's something that they can do. So again, you're kind of taking lifestyle into consideration, kind of like what I mentioned earlier with, there's a difference between a patient in an urban food desert on food stamps and someone not in that situation. In one situation, you might just have to target like the sugary drinks versus kind of going further with dietary change. Because we have to acknowledge what the person's current lifestyle is and what is kind of within their control versus not. Um, so for example, if you were focusing again on like sun protection habits, you could maybe set up like a photo booth where you took UV photos of folks passersby, showing them their personal photos of skin damage. So that would prevent comparative optimism, because you're showing the person exactly what their skin looks like. And it's moderate, it's not kind of too over the top. And then maybe you provide them with a brief infographic or a link to a QR, or not a link to a QR code, but a QR code, maybe linking to an infographic or more information about quick, easy, sun-safe behaviors that are easy to do. And then maybe you give them a free sample of sunscreen, so we're not dealing with the behavior of like, oh great, now I'm kind of scared because of this picture, and now I've got to go to the store and like, what SPF do I even buy? What's the difference between chemical and physical sunscreens? If you just give them a sample, you're automatically taking a step closer towards making that immediate behavior change more within their control. Other things to take into consideration are more tailored messaging. So this kind of goes back to the idea of thinking about who the target is. So thinking about who the person is demographically. You could even target messages not as much to like a demographic group, like kids or adults or whatever, or men or women, but you could focus more on a stage of change. So instead of breaking down the smoking issue to like boomers who've been smoking for 50 years versus Gen Zers who are vaping, you could focus more on people who are in the contemplation stage, and how do we get to move them to the preparation stage. You can focus on people who have the same barrier. So maybe people who have a financial barrier to purchasing a nicotine replacement like nicotine gum or something. So maybe doesn't matter who the person is or what stage of change there is, but you're focusing your campaign on making that product more accessible to people who could not purchase that product on their own. Or maybe you're tailoring the message to a particular benefit, or something like that. So that's basically to say that tailoring can take a lot of different forms, not just focusing on demographics. Tailoring can also include, or not tailoring, but programming and campaigning can also include policy change. So you don't necessarily have to be speaking to people or groups of people and trying to get them to change their behaviors. You can instead work on more of like a policy political type of level and try to make people healthier by changing the policies around them. So you can work on campaigning to get more bike paths created, or to ban smoking in public offices as a way to make people healthier by like not even communicating to them particularly, but by making it easier to engage in health behaviors. So now that we know the good and the bad ways basically to campaign, now we need to focus more on the content of the campaign. So what exactly is the message? Because at the end of the day, you could do all the stuff on this slide, but then if the message isn't quite right, then you're not really going to get the behavioral outcome that you're aiming for. So first of all, it can be important to focus on how a a campaign is framed, how a message is framed or worded. And in general, there are two different ways we can frame a message. There's a gains framed way of kind of orienting messages and a loss framed orientation. Gains framed messages depict behavioral change in terms of what you'll gain through exercise. So if you exercise, you will feel better, you will have more energy. Loss frame messages tend to focus more on what you'll lose through inaction. So if you don't exercise, you will lose your health. You will increase your risk of an undetected fatal disease. So that's kind of the difference, what you'll get through action versus what you'll lose through inaction. And at the end of the day, tailoring, of course, comes into play here because based on the orientation of your audience, one of those framings is going to be more helpful than the others. So if you've got an approach-oriented audience, again, remembering that approach orientation means that you are going to cope with stressors through either the problem-solving method or the emotion-focused method. These are people who are more highly responsive to reward and incentive. And so gains frame is going to be better for this group because you're telling them what the reward is going to be from the behavior change. Versus if you have more avoidance oriented individuals, again, people who are more likely to address stressors by just avoiding them, they're more responsive to punishment and threat. So you're more likely to win these people over through loss framed messages, tell them how they're going to be punished or what they're going to lose if they do not change their behaviors. It's also important to consider the goal or the outcome in mind when framing a message. So when focusing more on preventative behaviors, like using sunscreen to prevent skin cancer. Gains framed messages can be more helpful versus if you are focusing more on illness detection behaviors, like getting mammograms regularly to possibly detect a breast cancer, then loss framed messages can be more effective. Okay, so that is all the stuff that I have for you guys today. One of the things that I wanted you guys to think about between now and our next class in terms of messaging and programming is to just pay attention to some of the ads that you guys get, and just kind of be thinking about programming and how messages are being presented and whether or not the advertiser or the marketer is engaging in helpful programming and messaging that is going to be driven towards behavior change or unhelpful. In general, like I found that you can kind of apply much of this to messaging in general. Like in the fall, I talked with my classes a lot about like political ads and like scare tactics in that perspective, but try to focus a little bit more on health ads. But yeah, just be kind of thinking about this and we'll talk about this more when we meet next. Alrighty.